There are battles remembered for cities taken, ridgelines held, and flags raised over ruined ground. And then there are battles like the Philippine Sea, where history turned over empty water. In June 1944, west of the Marianas, the Pacific War reached one of its decisive moments. No trench line marked the front. No soldier could point to a hill and say, "This is where the day was won." Instead, there was only distance, radar, flight decks, and the merciless arithmetic of fuel, timing, training, and reach. Over 2 days, fleets searched for each other across a horizon so wide it seemed to swallow nations. When the clash finally came, it was not simply a victory in ships sunk or aircraft destroyed. It was the breaking point of Japan's carrier aviation. It was the battle that cleared the sky above the Marianas and helped open the road toward the Japanese home islands. This was not just another carrier duel. It was the moment when sea power, air power, and an amphibious invasion merged into one enormous contest of survival. And when it ended, the Imperial Japanese Navy still had ships afloat, but it no longer possessed the trained striking arm that had once terrorized the Pacific. To understand why the battle mattered, you have to begin with Saipan. On June 15, 1944, American forces landed there as part of the wider Marianas campaign. Saipan was not just another island in a long chain of island-hopping operations. It sat inside a strategic ring that Japan could no longer afford to lose. Along with Tinian and Guam, it formed part of the Marianas, islands whose capture would place the Japanese home islands within range of sustained B-29 bombing. That reality gave the campaign a weight far beyond the beaches themselves. The carriers offshore were not hunting prestige. They were shielding an invasion that threatened the inner defensive perimeter of the Japanese Empire. Every destroyer screen, every combat air patrol, every radar plot on an American flagship was tied directly to men fighting ashore on Saipan. That is what made the coming naval battle so dangerous. It was not a duel detached from the land campaign. It was the shield fight around a strategic invasion. If Japan could break that shield, the landing force would be exposed. If the United States held firm, the Marianas would become a forward platform for the final approach toward Japan. Japan answered with what it hoped would be a decisive counterstroke. The plan was Operation Ago, a major attempt to bring the American fleet to battle and break the offensive in the Marianas. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa led the Japanese mobile fleet forward with the knowledge that his force was still formidable in appearance, but weaker in substance than the striking arm Japan had possessed earlier in the war. American strength was overwhelming: 7 fleet carriers and 8 light carriers against Japan's 5 fleet carriers and 4 light carriers. Ozawa's hope was not simply to close the numerical gap at sea. He believed land-based air power from Guam, Rota, and nearby bases could reinforce his carrier aircraft and help tip the balance. On paper, it offered him a chance. In reality, it rested on a dangerous assumption that Japanese naval aviation still had the trained pilots, tactical cohesion, and operational resilience to exploit that support. It did not. The aircraft were there in numbers. The courage was there in abundance, but the system underneath them had been drained by previous campaigns. Men rushed through shortened training could still fly into battle. They could not easily survive or dominate in the kind of coordinated carrier warfare that now awaited them. Facing Ozawa was Admiral Raymond Spruance, with Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher commanding the fast carriers of Task Force 58. Spruance's task sounds simple when reduced to a sentence: stop the Japanese fleet. In reality, it was more complicated than that. His first duty was not to chase glory across the western horizon. His first duty was to protect the Saipan invasion. That distinction shaped every major decision of the battle. Carrier commanders always feel the pull of offensive opportunity. Find the enemy first, strike first, kill first. But amphibious warfare imposes another kind of discipline. If Spruance pushed too far west in search of Ozawa and the Japanese slipped around him, the transports, fire support ships, and supply vessels off the invasion beaches might be placed in grave danger. So he held his fleet in a position that frustrated some aviators but made strategic sense. He was not fighting a pure fleet duel. He was guarding an invasion while waiting for the enemy to come into a killing zone defined by radar, fighters, and anti-aircraft fire. It was a command decision rooted not in hesitation, but in priority. The beaches mattered, the landing force mattered, and the battle would be fought on terms shaped by that fact. At dawn on June 19th, the Philippine Sea did not look like a battlefield. It looked enormous, calm, and almost indifferent. But that calm was deceptive. Search aircraft were already moving outward. Engine crews worked beneath the heat of carrier decks. Radar operators stared into glowing scopes. Fighter direction officers listened, calculated, and waited. Somewhere beyond sight, Japanese aircraft were being armed and launched. Carrier warfare in the Pacific often began in this strange atmosphere of suspended violence. Long minutes of procedure, signals, bearings, and silence before the sky suddenly filled with death. The Americans entered that morning with advantages that had been built patiently across the war. Strong fighter control, radar warning, disciplined deck operations, and air groups trained to fight together. The Japanese entered with bravery and determination, but with a quality gap they could not easily erase. In 1942, surprise and sharp tactical skill had often compensated for weakness. In 1944, those margins were gone. Over the Philippine Sea, the difference between a trained air arm and a depleted one would become brutally visible in a matter of hours. The opening strikes came against a fleet that was already alert. Japanese aircraft arrived not over scattered and uncertain defenders, but against an integrated defense system that had matured enormously since the early carrier battles of the war. American radar detected incoming raids at range. Hellcats were vectored out to intercept before many of the attackers could shape a clean approach. This mattered more than any single duel in the sky. Carrier battles are often remembered in heroic fragments, a fighter diving, a bomber burning, a torpedo track flashing white across the sea. But the real edge in the Philippine Sea came from the American ability to see, sort, and engage the raid before it ever became a coherent striking blow. The Japanese launched roughly 430 planes in 4 waves on June 19th. Many of those aircraft never reached a useful attack position. Some were broken up far from the fleet. Others pushed through only to find the final barrier waiting below, anti-aircraft fire rising in dense, disciplined curtains from the American screen. By the time the first day's action was fully underway, the Japanese offensive was already unraveling in the air. The phrase that endured from the battle was crude, almost casual, but it survived because it captured the terrifying imbalance of what happened next. As more Japanese waves came in, the pattern repeated: interception, disruption, separation, destruction. Hellcats slashed through formations that had lost cohesion. American ships filled the sky with shell bursts and tracer fire. Pilots who broke through often found themselves forced into hurried, badly aligned attacks against a fleet still maneuvering and still heavily defended. One American pilot later described the fighting as an old-fashioned turkey shoot, and the name attached itself permanently to the day. It was not a joke. It was an expression of how one-sided the air battle had become. At least 250 Japanese aircraft were shot down during the first day's air fighting, and the total attrition became even more severe once the battle as a whole was counted. The significance of that loss went far beyond numbers. Japan was not merely losing planes. It was losing the men needed to make carrier warfare possible. Every falling aircraft represented training, experience, tactical memory, and combat confidence being burned out of the fleet in front of American eyes. What made the slaughter so complete was the way American systems overlapped. This was not just a fighter victory and not just a gunnery victory. It was the integration of both. The Japanese attackers had to survive early interception, then penetrate through the outer fighter screen, then descend into a zone saturated with anti-aircraft fire from battleships, cruisers, and destroyers. On American decks, sailors at 40mm and 20mm guns looked up into a sky crowded with contrails, black bursts, diving shapes, and flaming wreckage. To them, the battle was not an abstract triumph of doctrine. It was noise, heat, shock, and repetition. Fire, reload, track. Fire again. Above them, aviators in Hellcats were fighting a different version of the same battle. Short bursts, hard turns, quick identifications, and the constant danger of overshooting into another formation or descending into friendly fire zones. The result was catastrophic for the Japanese. The attack waves were brave, but bravery alone could not cross a layered defense built on warning, control, and overwhelming industrial strength. By midday, the offensive power Ozawa had hoped to unleash was being consumed faster than he could understand, much less restore. The Japanese carrier force was not only under attack in the sky, it was also being stalked from beneath the sea. This is one of the most important parts of the battle, because it reminds us how vulnerable a carrier fleet truly is. For all their power, carriers are delicate engines of aviation fuel, bombs, munitions elevators, and tightly packed aircraft. One submarine hit at the wrong moment can turn a modern flight deck into an inferno. On June 19th, the American submarine Albacore struck the Japanese carrier Taiho. Another American submarine, Kavala, attacked and doomed Shokaku. Two great carriers were lost not to dive bombers, but to torpedoes from unseen hunters below the surface. The damage mattered in material terms, but even more in operational ones. Carriers are not just hulls, they are moving airfields, command nodes, fuel systems, maintenance bases, and launch platforms. Their destruction shattered the cycle of launch, recovery, refueling, and rearming on which naval aviation depends. Ozawa's battle plan had already been mauled in the air. Now the framework of his fleet itself was breaking apart. At the very moment he needed tempo, coordination, and continuity, those essentials were being ripped away from him. At the visible level, the Japanese were losing aircraft and carriers. At the deeper level, they were losing something far harder to rebuild: a professional naval air arm. This is what made the Philippine Sea so decisive. An aircraft factory can build another airplane. A shipyard, given time, can lay down another carrier. But there is no shortcut to creating an experienced combat pilot who understands formation discipline, fleet navigation, attack timing, deck procedures, and survival under pressure. American aviators in 1944 often entered battle after long, systematic training. Many Japanese replacements had far less preparation. Britannica notes that some went into combat with as little as 3 months of training. Their aircraft still had strengths, especially in maneuverability and range, but they were increasingly being flown by men asked to carry a burden no training pipeline could sustain. Over the Philippine Sea, that weakness was exposed under the harshest possible conditions. The battle was not simply a defeat. It was a draining away of the Japanese carrier air arm's remaining offensive future. When the smoke cleared, carriers still existed on paper. But without trained air crews, a carrier was becoming less a weapon than an empty stage. The second day of battle had a different character. On June 19th, the Japanese had come forward and been broken. On June 20th, the problem was finding them again before they escaped. Ozawa was retreating northward. The Americans searched across immense distances of open sea. This was no minor challenge. Carrier warfare in the Pacific was always a battle of range as much as firepower. A fleet could win the main engagement and still fail to bring the enemy to final destruction if contact was lost. That tension now sat at the center of American decision-making. Spruance had achieved his essential mission. The Saipan invasion remained covered, and Japanese air power had been shattered. But a chance still existed to strike the retreating fleet and deepen the defeat. The problem was time. Search planes had to locate the enemy. Plot rooms had to evaluate reports. Strike groups had to be launched with enough daylight to reach the target. And every minute that passed made the return journey more dangerous. The second day was therefore not a simple continuation of victory. It was a test of judgment at the edge of success, where the desire to finish the enemy had to be weighed against distance, fuel, and darkness. Late on June 20th, American scouts finally found the Japanese fleet. It was the opportunity Mitcher had been waiting for, but it arrived under cruel conditions. The target was at extreme range, and the hour was already late. Launching a strike now meant accepting a grim likelihood. Many aircraft would return after nightfall, low on fuel, scattered across a dark ocean. Not launching meant allowing the surviving enemy carriers to withdraw in better shape than they deserved. This was carrier warfare at its sharpest edge. Not simply courage, but courage measured against navigation tables and fuel gauges. Mitchell launched the strike. Aircraft rolled down flight decks and lifted into the evening sky in one of the most audacious decisions of the Pacific Carrier War. Dive bombers, torpedo bombers, and fighters headed west over a sea already starting to darken beneath them. For the pilots, this was no controlled defensive engagement like the day before. It was a long, outward flight into uncertainty, toward an enemy still capable of fighting back, followed by the promise of an even harder return. They were being sent not only toward battle, but toward darkness. When the American strike finally reached the Japanese fleet, it hit ships already staggered by the previous day's disaster. Dive bombers rolled down through the lowering light. Torpedo planes came in low across the water. Fighters swept above them and pushed through enemy opposition. The attack was not the annihilation some Americans had hoped for, but it was severe. The carrier Hio was sunk. Other carriers and ships were damaged. Oilers were hit as well. It was a blow delivered not against a full-strength battle line, but against a fleet already bleeding away its offensive purpose. And yet the attack had an importance beyond the physical damage. It demonstrated that the Americans could still project striking power at great distance late in the campaign day, pressing the advantage rather than merely holding the line. It completed the psychological arc of the battle. On June 19th, the Japanese offensive had been crushed. On June 20th, the Americans proved they could still reach a retreating enemy and hurt it badly. But even as bombs fell and Japanese ships burned, another danger was rising fast. The danger of bringing the strike home. For the Japanese, the second day confirmed what the first had already begun. This was no longer a battle that could be recovered by one clean hit or one well-timed counterattack. It was now a managed collapse. The fleet was still moving. Escorts still maneuvered, guns still fired. But the strategic promise of the mobile fleet had been broken. A carrier force depends on rhythm, launch, recover, refuel, rearm, strike again. Lose too many aircraft, too many deck crews, too many trained pilots, and the whole machine ceases to function as a true offensive instrument. The sight of damaged carriers withdrawing northward under the evening sky symbolized more than retreat. It symbolized exhaustion at the system level. For years, Japanese carrier aviation had been one of the most feared weapons in the Pacific. At the Philippine Sea, that reputation died not in one sudden explosion, but in layers. Broken airstrikes, lost carriers, scattered survivors, and a fleet that could no longer impose itself on events. Even where ships remained afloat, the offensive soul of the force was gone. The most human chapter of the battle began after the strike was already leaving the target area. The American aviators turned east toward home, but home lay far away across a darkening ocean. Fuel gauges were falling. Formations were breaking apart. Aircraft that had crossed hundreds of miles to attack now had to find moving carrier decks in the night. For many crews, the enemy was no longer Japanese fighters or anti-aircraft fire. It was arithmetic. Distance against fuel, darkness against navigation, nerves against fatigue. Radios filled with tense reports from men preparing to ditch or unsure of their bearings. A carrier deck in daylight is a difficult place to land. A carrier deck at night after combat, at the limit of range, was something else entirely. In that long return, the battle changed emotional texture. Triumph gave way to anxiety. Success became uncertainty. Men who had flown through flak now faced a quieter terror, the possibility of vanishing into black water because they had won too far from home. It is one of the reasons the Philippine Sea remains more than a story of numbers. Beneath the strategy and the fleet movements lies this hard fact: even victory could still kill you. Then came one of the defining acts of the battle. To help guide the returning planes back, the American fleet illuminated itself. It was a dangerous decision. Carrier groups at sea lived by concealment. Lighting the ships invited risk from submarines and any remaining enemy aircraft. But Mitchell and subordinate commanders understood the alternative. Without visible reference points, many more aviators would be lost in the dark. So the fleet became a beacon. Decks glowed. Searchlights and star shells helped mark the task groups. Pilots landed wherever they could, often on the first suitable carrier they found rather than their assigned ship. Others ditched near escorts and awaited rescue. The image endures because it contains the whole contradiction of naval warfare. Fleets survive by hiding, yet on that night they chose to be seen in order to save their men. The order to turn on the lights was not romantic sentiment. It was disciplined, calculated risk taken in the service of recovery. It transformed the Black Ocean into a last fragile path home. Many aircraft were still lost. Not every crew returned, but countless lives were saved by that brief illumination. It remains one of the most unforgettable scenes in Pacific naval history. By the end of the Philippine Sea, the result was beyond dispute. Japan had lost 3 carriers, hundreds of aircraft, and, most critically, the trained air crews required to wage large-scale carrier war. American losses were far lighter. The battle did not sink every major Japanese ship, and critics would later argue that Spruance had missed a chance to destroy more of the retreating fleet. But that debate, however real, should not obscure what had actually happened. The Saipan invasion had been protected. The Marianas campaign had been secured. The path toward Guam and Tinian was opened, and the Japanese carrier force had been reduced from a dangerous offensive arm to something increasingly hollow. In later battles, Japanese carriers would still appear. Yet more and more, they would do so without the trained aviation strength that once made them decisive. That is why the Philippine Sea mattered so deeply. It was not merely the largest carrier battle of the war, it was the battle that stripped Japan of its ability to fight another great carrier campaign on equal terms. Over those 2 days in June 1944, on an ocean with no fixed front and no shelter, the future of the Pacific War tilted decisively. Japan did not lose the war there in a single stroke, but over the Philippine Sea, it lost the power to stop the way the war was now going.